Back in 2019, I upgraded all 4 of my C5 shocks with C6 Z06 shocks. You heard that correctly, I used C6 Z06 shocks and they fit without any modifications. Now this is a pretty popular modification that in the scheme of things is also relatively low cost. And back in 2019, after reading plenty of reviews, mostly positive, I decided it was worth a shot. As a side note, it also made sense to me that since the C5 and the C6 are very close in terms of weight and suspension geometry, that the tweaks that the GM engineers had done to the C6 Z06 shocks should complement the C5 quite well. Furthermore, since the C5 shocks were likely designed in 1996, and the C6 Z06 shocks were designed in 2007, GM engineers had a ton more data to work with and likely better shock technology as well. So 4 years have gone by, and so in this video I will share my thoughts as to whether or not the C6 Z06 shocks are worth the money, as well as if I could magically go back and do it all over again, would I? We'll talk about all that and a whole lot more next.
Toys for life.
Shortly after installing the C6 Z06 shocks on the C5, I was starting to have some regrets. Roads that were previously bumpy were now bumpy to the point where I was getting annoyed. And then a funny thing happened, and after about 30 days or so, the C6 Z06 shocks seemed to have broken in quite a bit, and while they remained noticeably firmer than the stock C5 shocks, they were no longer noticeably harsh. In retrospect, it's entirely possible that it was me getting used to the shocks over those first 30 days, but with an awareness of that possibility in mind, I believe that the shocks did in fact break in over that first month, and then they stabilized, and now they have a firm, confident level of dampening that's remained the same over the past 3 or 4 years. So do I think the C6 Z06 shocks are worth the money? Without hesitation, I would say yes. So if you're looking for a ride for your C5 that is firm and confident but not jarring, I think you'd like them, and the price is reasonable. So the C6 Z06 shock upgrade for the C5 definitely earns my endorsement, and if you're interested in seeing these shocks and how much they cost, be sure to check out the links below. And if you're interested in seeing the exact installation process for C6 Z06 shocks on the C5, let's walk through the video from when I installed mine back in 2019. The first step is to get the C5 up in the air, high enough to get the tires off, or if you prefer, you can get it up a little bit higher, which will make it easier to remove and install the shock absorbers. Next step, go ahead and remove the rear tires, which gives us excellent access to the rear shock absorbers, and we simply need to remove this larger bolt that goes through the A-arm at the bottom, and then the 2 smaller bolts which attach the shock to the chassis. The lower bolt is probably metric, but I use a 15/16 socket to get it off that fits snug and will not strip the nut. And then notice I have a jack stand under here as well, supporting the A-arm, and gives me the ability for it to be loose so I can remove the bolt. Up at the top here, we'll go ahead and remove these 1/2-inch bolts, or 13mm, and to do that, I just used a 1/2-inch socket with a short extension on a flex 3/8 ratchet. When I look at the way the chassis here is engineered, I just don't see why people put coilovers on this over the long term, thousands of miles. I don't think it's engineered to carry the weight up here where the shock bolts to the chassis, and it is engineered, as you can see, for that transverse composite leaf spring to carry the load. Check this out, where that shock bolts to the chassis, that is a cast aluminum piece, and in my mind, that's a lot more rigid than the C5. Next, you need to go ahead and finagle the shock out between the axle shaft and the center of the A-arm. What I found works best is if you compress the shock, and it gives you the ability to kind of twist and turn it more, and it will drop out through that center of the A-arm, and you can get it onto the ground here, where I've got it next to the C6 Z06 shock, which is on the right, and the C5 shock is on the left. As you can see, there is an obvious difference in the diameters, which has to do with their ability to dampen and whatnot. The lengths are the same, everything else is the same, so they bolt up just fine. One tip to install the rear shocks, go ahead and compress them and hold them in the compressed state using preferably zip ties if you've got some heavy duty ones. I didn't, so I used a coat hanger, which was much harder than zip ties if I had them. Anyway, that'll allow you to fish the shock up through the center of the A-arm, get it in place where you can hand tighten the top bolts. Then you can slide the big bolt in through the shock and the A-arm, install the nut on that, and then go ahead and torque the bolts down. I torqued my top ones to 22 foot-pounds and the bottom large bolt to 120 foot-pounds. You should use a source for tightening specs that you trust, because there's all kinds of discrepancies on the internet. Anyway, 20 minutes roughly from start to finish for this one shock, and I'm going to go ahead and show you the other side here. No details. It was the same thing we just did. So now let's move to the front end and work on replacing those shocks. Got the front wheel off. Shock absorber straddles the A-arms, lower and upper. I'm going to start with taking the top one off. I'm going to go ahead and give this a little shot of penetrating fluid so it makes it easier. Okay, here's a better shot. You can see 15mm nut with the wrench on it, and the wrench holding the flat on the shock while I loosen the nut. I also lowered the car a little bit down onto a jack stand holding that A-arm to limit how far down it can go. And with that, I'm successfully able to take the bushing, washer, and lock nut the rest of the way off of the shaft. So that was pretty simple. Next step is to go ahead and get the two lower shock mount bolts off. Okay, here's the 2003 C5 shock on the left against the Z06 shock on the right. Clearly physical differences. Hopefully this lends itself to superior handling. The way I got the shock out of here is I compressed it down from the top as best I could, and then I lifted up and slid the bottom side over into this little nook through here to drop it out. It took quite a bit of strength to do that. If you're fairly strong, you should have no problem. If you're getting up there in years and strength is becoming a little bit of a problem, you might want to get a little help trying to finagle that shock out, because you do have to compress it to slide it out. So I'm going to go ahead and compress this one and see if I can slide it up into position, the C6 Z06 shock. Quick tip on how to compress the shock. Have an assistant compress it for you. Have a noose around a little piece of rope on the top portion, and then thread it through the bottom hole, and when it's compressed, grab it with a vice grip so it cannot extend. Okay, the passenger side is complete. Got the top bolt buttoned down. Got both of the lower shock bolts buttoned down. And it was kind of a pain in the butt. The C6 Z06 shocks, it takes a lot of energy to compress them. And you have to use coat hangers or zip ties. Or in my case, I actually used a piece of rope to get it to compress, which is the only way you can get it into position to get this up through the upper mount. So passenger side is done. Moving on to the driver's side, pretty much reverse. Same thing you did on the passenger side. I want to note the top spec is 15 foot-pounds and the bottom ones are 21 foot-pounds, or about 250 inch-pounds. If anybody's got a good way to get a torque reading on something like this from underneath the car, let me know. But I did the 15 foot-pounds by the old handometer. One other tip here for the upper 15mm bolt, you don't get a lot of sweep when you're doing this, so this kind of a wrench with the micro ratcheting mechanism will save you a lot of time. That's a wrap on this one, guys. If you got anything out of it, hit that thumbs up and leave a comment below so YouTube knows to share it with the C5 community. But most importantly, thanks for watching.